Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. It's another beautiful Sunday afternoon in the universe. And this is part of the American Knowledge Team meeting, which actually includes Canada and Mexico. The Americas includes South America as well. And also we are represented, thankfully, by many others from the other continents around the world. So thank you all for being here. This is a very important time because we're in the post-Sanya conference era where we have found gold in them Dar Hills, and we're trying to explain the science of the Kesh Foundation so that new knowledge seekers can join us without having to go through the thousands and thousands of hours of teaching and be dismayed by the mountain of knowledge that they have to acquire. Let's understand that this is all part and parcel of our inherent being. This Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We are in the intermediate transition stage of these sessions. Today, we're going to talk again about the Eagle's Gift. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is June the 30th, 2024. This is the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we have continued our intermediate classes. And as you can see, there's a diary of all the sessions that we've been trying to go through over the years. And in this intermediate transition series, we've been discussing the y-axis polarity and what it means. We're trying to throw a little light on our perspective, the North Pole. Last week we talked about quarks, and today we're going to talk about the Eagle's Gift. Because we're all on the hesitancy highway, and of course that is the lowest energy state. And so to make it easier for us, because life is hard, we have to get up on the horse. Well, the question is, can you pick the winning horse? And what does it mean to be a winner? Because this could lead to conflict. And of course, when you have conflict, there is often an unpleasant climax. So we do have to talk about some unpleasant things sometimes. In Understanding the Plasma Science by Marin Tabakoli Kesh, as he's put forward in the first three books, book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter. Matter is something that matters to us because in our touchy-feely world, that's what we have. But our touchy and feely sometimes means more than just the physicality. And in order to understand that better, there's book number 2, The Structure of the Light. And if you've ever tried to build something and you find that the light is not part of the building blocks that you use, is it? Because the light seems to be very transparent. And then, of course, is book number 3, The Origin of the Universe. And shouldn't that be book number 1? But interestingly enough, where you have the one and it creates 2, and one of those 2 is our little tiny perfect world, man's universe. Well, isn't that interesting? And so that becomes our one planet. And as such, one planet, we're all here as one nation, one race for justice and world peace, because that's how this planet needs to operate. And we've been trying to do that for 332 weeks in a row, as hosted by Rick Crammond and the members of the Universal Council. And we will continue to do that, because when those responsible abdicate the responsibility, someone has to take over. Otherwise, we'll never get on this plasma highway, because how far are we? Pull out the roadmap and see. Well, there is a transmission highway, and it is far removed by orders of magnitude. And so now we're discussing only the transition highway, which is kind of getting us on the road to the plasma highway. So when we look at our tiny perfect world and we see it as a pie chart, and we understand that the speed of light is constant transmission, but we find that that transmission can transmit beyond our little pie chart. And so the speed of light and its constancy becomes a symbol of truth, doesn't it? But people say that the universe is only 70% hydrogen. And hydrogen being such a small element, you could stick it in a thimble and wonder if that's a thimble of truth. So wherever you are, there you are. And so you're either here or you are here. So please show me the electron map, because that's kind of what we see when two forces come together. We see them as electrons, and they come together from multiple directions, and we refer to them as part of the x-axis dimension and the y-axis dimension. And this could be a point of conflict. And so many times we try and resolve these points of conflict with conflict resolution. And this conflict sometimes needs to be contained. And so that becomes not just a point of conflict, but a point of containment. And that point of containment facilitates an energy binding. And this is important. It's a very self-serving type of energy. And it's important with respect to your creation. And it's very important with your neighbor's creation. And yet we've extended it to be self-serving at the expense of others. Well, if we need that energy binding and our neighbor needs the energy binding, and we've gotten it from other than our neighbor's source, why are we now so reliant on stealing it from our neighbor? And of course, if they won't give it, well, then, maybe we have to kill them. And so this becomes a real problem, because there are those who will kill for money. We call them soldiers of fortune, and they're in every nationality. So you see them, and they're brave, like the samurai warrior or the Spartans of history. These are all brave hearts. And the thing about the brave hearts is, as we know about the heart, it's very emotional. And as such, it affects what we call loosh. A loosh is governed by the law of detachment, but when we fail to obey that law, we involve ourselves in fear and greed. And also, we constantly are seeking ego validation. And then, of course, some of us have problems where we leak extensively. We seem to be not able to contain our loosh and just kind of leak all over the place like a broken bag of milk. And yet there are others who steal, and we call that loosh harvesting. And by extension, it becomes part of the physical feeding system. And the vast majority of us on this planet are involved in this physical feeding system. So we partake in the food chain. And some of us become part of the food chain in other ways, because historically speaking, we have this eternal war at the expense of others. And when we say war, I mean war, the kind of war that is very disruptive. So if we understand that the plasma manifestation precedes the physical manifestation, then we have to look at the physical manifestation may manifest differently in different people, although the plasmatic manifestation is the same. So something is different. And this physical manifestation may be something like simple as obesity, blood pressure, or cancer. And so we find that when we look at the pH of the blood serum, we find that a higher acidity causes an anaerobic condition. A higher acidity causes a DNA expansion. It also causes ATP, adenosine triphosphate, reduction. And of course, it causes cellular communication disruption. But there are other disruptions, and that's the point. So when we look at rules, the most important rule is the plasma rule, where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. But most of those who are into energy binding and stealing from others believe in the rule where the higher strength eats the weaker strength. So either way, this could be a point of conflict. And the question then becomes is, well, how do we resolve this conflict? So there's many ways, of course. And when we talk about energy, there's a negative charge principle where the negative gives and the positive takes. And so when the giving and the taking is from oneself, then that energy is binding. And as I said, that's essential if you want to create your own energy field. But to endure, energy has to be flowing, where the giving is to others and the taking is from others. So we have a choice here where the energy can be flowing or it can be binding. And it's not limited to one or the other, but concurrently. It's just how transmission works. And so when we discuss terminology in the basics, we found that the rotation is part of the transmission and the polarity is part of the transition. And so collectively, they create a field strength, which we call the transmutation. But now, as we delve deeper, we find that the transmission itself has 3 dimensions. And so we discuss the x-axis transition dimension, because you can transit from one transmission dimension to another transmission dimension. And as we said, we are in the intermediate transition session. Interestingly, the y-axis also can do a transmission, and it has to go through a transition dimension. So this becomes part of the medium. And all of us who've ever used a telephone, we know that the telephone is the medium and then we can communicate. And that was done with wire. And most of us are hooked up on the internet, and the company here refers to the old technology as copper. And the new technology is fiber. And so the old technology is through copper wire, and the new technology is through fiber optic cable. But either way, it's still a cable, even though what they call Wi-Fi, which is wireless communication. And so that becomes the transmission dimension, and that becomes the medium. But that's not the message. So as you use the cell phone, you convey that message over the medium. And so this is the energy of the universe and how it moves. So when we look at the creation of the universe and we see that it exists from energy, and so this energy has to move, and it's always moving. So it's always positive energy, isn't it? You're always giving. So, it's when you're talking on the cell phone, you're communicating, you're giving your energy as part of the message. And so the energy is a charge in motion. So, when you talk on the cell phone, you're giving. And when someone else talks back to you, well, you're receiving. So we see that all things are working in combination. So when we look at the structure of light, and we see now our internet communication has graduated from copper to fiber and is actually using the light as the medium. Isn't that interesting? But it's still in the physicality. But we see that the light can come from various sources. Say, for instance, it can come from the sun, which is the primary source that we're concerned about. And that light can be quite bright on a sunny day and it's highly visible, but there's also another light that is emitted from the earth. And so the interaction of that light with the interaction from the solar light creates a maggrav condition, an interaction. And when we understand that the gravitational aspect of the sun and the gravitational aspect of the earth are only two dimensions, we find that the origin of the universe transmits another magnetical field. And so the convergence of those three give us the hydrogen. And in its gravitational form, it has a fingerprint, and that fingerprint is constructed of light, and that light is physical, and it's unique. So the structure of the hydrogen spectrum is basically a combination of three elements that come together as they do in the maggrav condition, as we saw in the cover of book number 1, where you have the matter, dark matter, and antimatter. So as this energy is converging, it comes in the form of an energy pack. But that energy pack has to be in some kind of containment. And so that is an energy parceling unit. And that energy is different, as is the variety of everything in this universe. And so the question is, how do we select which one? Do we select it by direction? Since the energy is coming from all over the place, then in our field, we can accept the energy from all over the place. So it's not just the x-axis or the y-axis. And since the energy is different, then we can also absorb it or capture it in different strengths. And so this becomes a selection process of the principal matter. And as we said, with the sun and the earth, there's a principal interaction then. So the energy is in motion. We say it's in a two-way street. So therefore, there has to be a two-way transmission and, of course, a two-way transition as well. So the sun has a containment and also has an interaction with the earth. And the earth has a containment and an interaction with the sun. But when we look at the principal energy flow around the earth, we find that that energy is in the blue section. That's why we call it the blue planet. It is the water planet. This becomes a very important characteristic. So when we look at this interaction, it's not just an interaction of the equatorial versus the polar interaction, but it brings together other energies. And so we create this energy parceling unit, which we call water, which is the universal solvent on this planet. And is comprised, of course, of hydrogen and oxygen. And so we say the hydrogen is magnetical and the oxygen is gravitational, but when you look at the difference in terms of mass, the hydrogen is a 1 and the oxygen is an 8. Even though there are two hydrogens, now that makes it 2 versus 8. It's not very symmetrical, yet the water molecule is round. And also it becomes a balanced mag-grav condition. So we're not taking enough into account when we look at how this energy parceling unit is constructed. And then furthermore, we can shear one of these electrons off. And because it's a positive energy, it can go somewhere. We don't know where. And so what does that leave behind? Well, it leaves behind a negative field. And we only have the one hydrogen and the one oxygen. And so that forms a hydroxyl. And now it's looking for a partner. And in the process of doing that, so both are looking for a partner. And so this amalgamation of energies comes together in a crossover or a deflection or a twisting. And when we talk about a twisting, we talk about a coiling, and that coiling can be tightened or loosened, and it can create a tunnel. And so these are all forms of energy packs. And as we said, they're always in motion. And so when we look at the relationship of sugar as a main energy for us, and we see the crystalline structure, we see a hexagonal formation and a pentagonal formation. So the first one is gravitational, and the second one is magnetical. And then when we look at the two and we see all similar components, so the only difference really is in the crystalline structure. And that difference in crystalline structure allows this twisting susceptibility. And so this twisting creates this rotation. And of course, once one gets filled and the other one gets empty, then it has to flip back to get filled again, and then can give and get empty again. And so there's a constant flipping. So we see on the outside, we see fields of motion. We see energy pathways. But within the pole, we see energy flow from the North Pole to the South Pole and from the South Pole to the North Pole. So when we look at the polar point of view, we see the two-way street. One way is up and one way is down. But when we say up and when we say down, if you're standing on the surface of the earth, well, we know which way is up and which way is down. But when you're in the earth, how do you know which way is up? And does it really matter? If you're in the matter state, it does matter. But if you're in the energy state, then the question is, are you magnetical or are you gravitational? And then there has to be a relationship between the magnetical and gravitational force fields. They create a maggrav. And when that maggrav is in balance, it becomes invisible. So if it is not perfectly in balance, then it becomes visible. And so that relationship we can talk about scientifically because we have the balance effects through the conservation of magnetic fields and the conservation of energy. And if we look at the spiritual community and we see the relationship between the spirit and the soul, where the spirit is the motor of the soul. And the reason for that, of course, is because there's a lot of energy in that rotating field, isn't there? And that's how we operate on this planet, isn't it? But the plasma science adds to this knowledge because not only does it amalgamate the scientific and the spiritual communities, but it also explains how energy moves. And so there are rules. And those rules we call laws. And one of the laws is the conservation of energy that we just said. So energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be converted from one form of energy to another. And so that lends itself to a formula, and the formula is in balance. So on the one side, there's a relationship between the kinetic and potential energy. And on the other side, there's a similar relationship, but this is the final kinetic and potential energy. And so as these values change, the equation remains the same. The equation remains constant. And so the obvious thing is, how do we contain that energy within our physicality, ignoring the fact that there are other dimensions? So when we just look at our physicality and we see on the pH scale, it reflects the pH of strength, actually, where on the higher pH, it's strong, and the lower pH, it's weak. So the stronger pH has an initial potential energy, therefore it's gravitational, and the weak has a final potential energy, and therefore it's very simple. And all the other energies in between are varied depending on their susceptibility. So we haven't discussed on how to account for that. We're just looking for how we have sequences. So there's a sequence of attraction, we call it gravitational feedback, and there's a sequence of repulsion, which we call magnetical feeding. And the two work together. And we have to make choices. Yes, yes, we are the last man standing. We have to make the choices. This is not something that we can delegate or pawn off. We have the capability of turning on and turning off the feeding. We have the capability of increasing and decreasing the field strength. It's just a normal extension. Then we can enhance and diminish our positioning. And these are all the rules. We've talked about rules. The stronger feeds the weaker. So in that process, something is feeding, and in that process, there has to be a capture, a taking. And so we find that the x-axis transition, and we say it's perpendicular to the ground, Well, the y-axis transition is elevated above the ground. And so the question then becomes is which ground? And then how does it move? How does it happen where there's a transmission on the x-axis and a transmission on the y-axis and there's movement, and we say that there's a medium and the message travels on the medium? Well, how is the difference in position facilitated? So when we look at it, the stability, when we look at the neutral pH of water, and we call it the potentiation of hydrogen, which means the release of the hydrogen. But if we release the hydrogen, well, of course, we have to release the oxygen because the oxygen is also a component of the water. So we could easily call that the potentiation of oxygen as well. And so when we look at the various pH levels, we find that the pH splits up into acid and alkaline. And that pH is dictated by the constancy of the total value of the pH, which is 14. So if we look at the neutral pH of water and it's 7, how does 7 add up to 14? Well, you see that there are layers. There's a 7 acidic and there's a 7 alkaline, and the two together total 14, and both are neutral. But when that water splits up, where you have one water that is acidic, then the water that's left behind becomes alkaline. And it's predetermined. If you choose 6, then you have to choose 8. 6 and 8 is 14. That's the rule. And so you think of the water splitting as a zipper. The farther you deviate from the midpoint of 7, the wider the zipper goes. And you go down the various layers. So we started at 6 and created 8, but let's go to 5, and then we create 9, and then let's go to 4, and then we create 10. And so we find that as we navigate through these layers, this is all part of the y-axis transition. But what we don't really know is how this x-axis dimension is moving. How do you move from one pH to another pH? And we still avoid talking about that because we're just trying to understand this transition. Because with this transition, there are peaks and valleys. And so if we look at the peak on one end and the valley of the other end, we have to understand that they have to correspond. So if you create a peak on one end, you have to create a peak on the other end. So 4 and 10 are 14. And then if you create a valley on one end, you create a valley on the other end. So it's 5 and 9 is 14. But 5 is not always a valley. Sometimes it's a peak. And so you will have this y-axis transition of a pumping action going up and down, up and down. It's kind of the way life seems to be. It isn't just rotating around the x-axis. It also has this y-axis, which is a dimension by polarity. And so everything is rotating around that, and we see this perpendicularity between the y-axis and the x-axis. And in the perfection, they are not visible to each other, and yet they work together. And the reason they work together is because they are not always perpendicular. So as we're looking for outer space and then we continue our search, we find sometimes we're just poking around on the plasma highway to our little pie in the sky, if you catch my point. And a famous scientist, Richard Feynman, talked about electron fixation. And so that was part of his groundbreaking research on quantum electrodynamics. This is a theory that describes the interaction between light and matter. So the light is the one thing and the matter is the other thing. And then another scientist, Yoshiro Nambu, put forward the theory of positrons. And he said there's no creation nor annihilation, only a change of directions of moving particles. And this motion is from the past to the future or from the future to the past. And in both cases, what we're talking about is the electron. So when we talked last week about quarks, we find that they were blue quarks that were up. I guess they were Democratic, and the red quarks that were up, and I guess they were Republicans, and they had a little debate. But then there's this third one, the greens, and they come together, and somehow they're always going up and down, and we don't know why. So when we look at the perspective of hydrogen, we see the impact that it has. And the overriding impact that we want to emphasize is that in the alkaline state, which is healthy, we consider that the blue shift, and that this is good because we're on the blue planet, and we need a healthy blue planet. But the red shift is considered unhealthy and acidic, and the red shift has to do with the expansion of the universe. The divergence of the humanity, the separation of the humanity by color, by society, by country, by border, by economy, by force. And so we see, what does this mean with respect to the density range? And so we find that gravity seeks density. And since oxygen is more dense than hydrogen, then the oxygen is alkaline and the hydrogen is acidic. But the combination always totals 14. So we have learned about the nanocoating process. And in this process, we had the dimension of physicality where we took elements like copper and zinc and other things like salt water. And we created a nanocoating process on some of the copper, which was the process of monatomic science. And then we created GANs. And so we find that energies were going up and energies going down. And they were reflected of our emotional strength, even though we were looking at the physical manifestation. So we notice that the GANs on one side is white and the GANs on the other side is, shall we say, aquamarine. And so when we look at the cups of life, we find that we were able to create different gases, not just CO2 GANs, but calcium carbonate GANs, copper and zinc GANs. And then there was a different kind of GANs, a water GANs and an amino acid GANs. And of course, in the post-Sanya era, we now understand that there's gold GANs as well. So basically for us, we were looking at the emotional cup and the physical cup. Well, these are two different things. And yet, scientifically, the way they were produced were the same, but individual components were changed. And so those changes changed the environment, didn't they? And so when we look at the Earth and the periodic table of elements, we find that the Earth space is made up of a different range of elements. And when you look at these details, you find that they are elementary in their mass number. And that mass number refers to the proton. And as we have more protons, then the mass becomes bigger. And except for hydrogen, the other elements also gather in neutrons. And the mass becomes bigger still, significantly bigger. And in that process, it becomes more dense. So in that process, it becomes more gravitational. So when we look at our basic DNA, which is composed of carbon and a sugar phosphate backbone, and combine that with hydrogen and oxygen and with phosphorus, we create this basic DNA. And so we have RNA and DNA interacting. And so what we're talking about is engagement. And disengagement is the opposite of engagement, which is to say that undisengagement is impossible. So you either are engaged or you're not engaged. And so when we looked at the quarks last week, you're either up or you're down. And the way you do it is you have to flip around. So when are you up and when are you down? So when we look at the basic codons and how they were constructed, we find they come in pairs. But there's an interaction between the RNA and the DNA. And they are constructed from genes. And as a result, we have a science where we do gene therapy and gene modification. Some go so far as to do gene mutilation. And of course, we're looking at the plasma science, which involves the restoration to the origination. And this becomes very important. And the question is, how is that possible? So when we look at the DNA and we see that, well, there are different DNAs. There's a cellular DNA, there's a mitochondrial DNA. The vertical people, the plants, have a DNA, and the horizontal people have a DNA. But we seem to have the vertical and horizontal characteristic. And so that may lead to some confusion, but we are regulated to the horizontal people DNA because even though we walk vertically, we sleep horizontally. And in that process, that allows us to do certain things. And that allows us to do a transition to connect with the RNA. And the RNA facilitates this transcription of our unconsciousness, which is based in karma, which is carry forward. But now we've come to a process where we have a transgenerational karma as well. And this karma is grounding to this earth space. And this grounding is through the blood. And so blood becomes the link in man's history. And of course, man's history involves bloodletting, and the bloodletting involves war. So when we talk about exsanguination, this is death caused by the loss of blood. And depending on the health of the individual, Some people die from only losing half to 2/3 of their blood. What a relief. But a loss of 1/3 of blood volume is considered very serious. So when you look at a healthy adult, and there's an average of 4.5 to 5.5 liters circulating at any given time, which is kind of interesting considering that's how many liters of oil I have in my car. Anyway, most tolerates can lose up to 14% of their blood volume without physical symptoms or deviations in their vital signs. What a relief. And of course, a nice choice of words. They can tolerate it. Well, can you tolerate this? We have energy binding systems bound up in soldiers of fortune. And of course, they are motivated to march onward. And what's the point? Well, the point is destiny awaits them. So, of course, we have an amalgamation of forces. And maybe we can call them a united force of spear chuckers. And we motivate them to soar like an eagle, bite like a snake, and fight with honor. Yeah, that's it. Fight with honor. So we can do conflict resolution by conflict, right? So fight with honor, but obey us, and fight amongst yourselves, because there's no time for discussion. Well, it's my turn. It's my courage, not your courage. It's my honor, not your honor. It's my right, not your right. Now it's your turn. Oops. Something is intervening in my plans. Uh-oh. Hey, where's your spear? Uh-oh. Where's your shield? Hey, where's your body? Oh, well, at least you died with honor. We will remember you in our hearts. So we can say that there's a perpendicular separation, just like when we go to sleep, isn't it? We walk vertically and we sleep horizontally. So from an emotional perspective, there's a physical climax when we are a fallen warrior. But that fallen warrior has unresolved emotions, because that fallen warrior is marching onward to soar like an eagle and bite like a snake, to fight with honor. So what really happens is there's warrior separation. From an emotional perspective, there's an unresolved emotion. And that becomes part of the karma, the emotional carry forward. And so what falls in the horizontal position, of course, is the physical climax. And so the emotional carry forward becomes part of the feeding system. And the eagle will consume you. So how does this affect the soul positioning? So we see that the soul of the man has a containment within the physicality of the brain, which is functional when we are standing, or shall we say, when we are alive. And the mind carries the emotion of the soul of the man. But the soul of the body has an emotion, and that emotion is contained with the physical body. And so that is representative of the DNA positioning. And so the DNA positioning has a different intent, and it's reflected in the GANs. So when we look at the containment of the physical body, we find that the skin is the nanocoating. And within the nanocoating is the GANs. So within our skin is the GANs. And when we look at an X-ray, we can't see the GANs. We can't even see the blood. But what we do see is the physical structure of the bones. So what we don't see, of course, is the emotion. So the GANs has an affinity to the emotion. But the GANs emotion is tied to the soul of the body. The emotion of the soul of the man is different, which is why it's in a different position. And so when the soul of the body goes into its horizontal position, because it is now a fallen soldier, the emotion is unresolved. It has to decide what to do. So when we look at this y-axis transition, we find that the nanocoding is of a higher energy state, but it actually is visible in its physical state. And so the skin is like that as well. And the skin contains the GANs. So the GANs, as we see in the cup of life. And when that cup gets broken, the GANs get spilled all over. And that GANs is also physical. So there's something else that is affecting, and that is the emotion. So the GANs has an affinity to this emotion, and that emotion is specific to the soul of the body. It is also tied into the physicality of the earth. And so the earth itself has its own fields, its own nanocoding, its own GANs, and its own emotion. And so our existence here has to take that into account. But we see that things go up and down. Soldiers stand, soldiers fall. What does the emotion do? Well, think about it. When you're driving in the car, you're moving in one direction, but the foreground objects are moving in the opposite direction. And how far, when you're moving, do the objects move? But there are other objects in the picture, and their movement is undecided because it's all dependent on the perspective. because you can change the foreground movement by changing the car movement. So the balance of power sits elsewhere. So when we're looking at this pH of perspective, we see that there's a source and there's a destination. So the source, being gravitational, is part of the blue shift frequency, and the destination, being magnetical, becomes part of the red shift frequency. And of course, we've seen with the quarks, they can go up and down, or they can be strange. But the thing is, they can be more intense or less intense. A lot depends on the mass and the volume and the susceptibility. So when we're looking at the plasma shift, so we have to understand that the GANs and nanostate, although they're in a plasmatic condition, are actually physical. And so in that regard, they are part of the matter state. And so the matter state actually has a plasmatic aspect to it, which is non-physical. In other words, it's an energy state, and it is physical. In other words, it is a physical state. And there are transition states in between where you can transfer the energy from one to the other. And so this motion is totally different from that of the plasma state, which is actually composed of an interactive energy transfer state. And since the higher energy feeds the lower energy, the plasma state is the gravitational. So the lowest energy state being magnetical, being the physicality. So if the soldier has fallen and has lost his physicality, and the skin is no longer having its nano quality of being a superconductor at room temperature, and the GANs is spilled out, where is the grounding? Where does the blood go? It goes into the ground. It becomes part of the redshift, doesn't it? And turns our blue planet red. So we lose our grounding. What happens to the emotion? And this becomes very important because we need oxygen. And it's through the oxygen-rich blood that we exist on this planet. So the oxygen itself is a gravitational confirmation of life on this planet. So if we look at life on this planet and how it feeds back, and we summarize it as things to do with sound, light, heat, pressure, luster, superficiality, a containment within various laminar layers. And so we find that the x-axis transmission dimension goes through various transitions. But we have this dominance of this man-made range deviation. We see the conscious awareness overriding the unconscious awareness. But this y-axis transition dimension becomes exposed. So the oxygen-rich blood becomes the Earth space polar y-axis transition form artifact. The blood becomes the form artifact, often referred to as life. And what is the eagle's gift? Well, you see, the eagle's gift operates by a different set of rules. I am already given to the powers that rule my fate. So there's no reason to go to war. There's no reason to fight. There's no reason to have conflict. I want nothing, so I have no needs. So my self-containment is complete. And your self-containment is safe. I don't need to steal it. I have no thoughts, so I may see. I don't need to be prejudiced. I don't need to be racist. I don't need to fight you. I don't need to be terrorized by you either. I don't need to be fearful. I have no fear, so that I can remember myself. How can you remember yourself when you can't remember being born? Where were you before you were born? And where will you go after you die? And how will you get there? Well, you have to understand the law of detachment. You have to be emotionally detached, not fearful, and at ease. Why? To soar past the ego and be free. Because if you're not detached and at ease, when you decide to soar, the ego will consume you. And while you're in the heat of the battle and you lose your physicality, are you ready to accept the change of plans? Or will you be consumed by the ego or bitten by the snake? So do we understand the rules of the laws of detachment? Or how about these other rules where you have the universal law of interdependence, the service to others as opposed to service to self? Of course, there's the law of attraction. This is the golden rule, isn't it? A purpose, the sixth sense. And of course, the ultimate game of liars, poker. There's no poker playing in outer space. And there's no killing, whether the law allows it or not. This is the law of hurtfulness. And the worst hurtfulness is when you do it to yourself. So there's no suicide because life wishes to live. And the rules of life have these commandments. But these commandments are really a representation of the inherent ethics and morality of the universal community. So when we look at the transmission spectrum, we see that it's non-visible, that the manifestation of this non-visible viral spectrum is actually a transition of the visible transmission spectrums, where you can go from one spectrum to another spectrum based on susceptibility, which takes into account the surface superficiality versus the internal substance, the physical superficiality versus the plasma substrate. And so we find that the point of containment is the balance between the gravitational and the magnetical. But there is one step beyond. And so in this y-axis transition dimension, we have to keep our communication up, because that dimension is not the message, it's just a medium. And so our antenna has to stay within the range transition so that we can get the message, so that we can release the binding energy, because that precedes the retrieval of the beneficial energy. We can release the field, because that precedes the field capture. We have to give before we can take. We have to emit before we can absorb. So this is part of motion, and motion cannot exist without coexistence, because motion is a product of existence. Motion and coexistence reside in both matter states. So where we are in these matter states is dependent on the tuning. And the plasma tuning is dominant, but it precedes the physical dominant tuning. So the range transition by nearness and proximity has nothing to do with distance, nor time, nor history. So we can conclude that the y-axis transition dimension is not man-space centric, is it? And it's not Earth-space centric either. And, we're not sure if it's sun-space centric, but it certainly is dimension centric. And that proximity is part of that dimension centric nature. And the nature of pressure is dimension centric. So we have 3 transmission dimensions. The question becomes, what is the message? How is that message contained? And which transmission dimension has the folding deviation? And so we see the combination of the quarks, the I Ching, and the DNA. These are historical and transgenerational blueprints for energy transfer state to matter state in an undifferentiated state. So how do we determine our target? How do we find that reality dimension that is somewhere between the materialization of physicality and the dematerialization of our emotion, and that stability between the gravitational and magnetical field forces? That this will take us from our gravitational Earth space to that gravitational some space other place. So we find that the matter plasma dimension involves both the physical and the plasmatic state. And man is feedback dominant. That's part of our physical state. That's why we go to war. But the emotional girdle that supports that physical state, that sends the man to war, is also dominant. So when we set up our antenna, we have to understand the difference between the message feeding and the feedback manifestation. We can tune our transmission through the various transitions. And when we select one, it is balanced by a forced selection of another. That's what it means to be balanced. The resulting selections feed manifestation. So the selection manifestation, therefore, is predetermined, and we can facilitate that by choosing peace dome of intention. So this range transition affects standard folding deviation and leaves no room for war. The y-axis transition balance is to and from the peace dome. So when we talk about plasma balance, the knowledge and wisdom can give you deeper insight. And of course, experience will change a man's perspective. But in that regard, and especially when you get the point, misconduct becomes harder to rationalize. And the historical reference becomes meaningless. So does revenge. The pH balance becomes the polar balance. What are you emitting and what are you receiving? What is the neutral aspect of the pH of the mag-grav? And does it have to be neutral? Because when it's neutral, it's not visible. But when it deviates from the central neutral point, you get different points on the perspective scale. What about the pH of war? When you're on the horse, the high horse, or when you fall off the horse. And many warriors discover too late. And so we see that our blue planet is also on the pH scale. It's the bloodletting that turns the planet red. So when we look at the polarity, we see that there's many points in the polar scale, which allows the curvature of the Earth. And of course, there are two poles. It's a two-way street. A two-way street is the balancing of peace. And as you can see, there's many points on the dove. Beginning in July, we are doing the transmutation test for the next 4 months, preparing knowledge seekers to do the transmutation, which involves the understanding of the relationship between the physicality and the emotion. And it's for this reason that the Keshe Foundation is assembling research teams to understand that the Keshe technology has to do with the space program, because there are no wars in space. There are no spear chuckers and there are no ambulances and there are no churches or judges. We are in the post-March 15th era of 2024, and we can make a new selection process, looking for that graceful inner space, that greater oneness that transcends the limitations of nuclear science. And we have to make sure, as all technologies are confiscated by the military for 544 weeks in a row, we have been transmitting the knowledge seekers workshops, conveying the teachings of the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, teachings on plasma science. So we welcome all the beautiful knowledge seekers learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. And it requires a world peace treaty. So sign it quickly, sign it urgently, sign it with a pen, sign it with your soul, and sign it with some true emotion so that the ego doesn't consume you. Because you find that the man is a reactor of a three-dimensional universe. And can man find heaven through the field transition? Can man go into outer space without a peace dome? So we're mining the transition dimensions of truth and history. And in that history, for that which we fight, is that really necessary? So we need to stay within the range of standard deviation of honor. There is no glory for the soldier of fortune. Detached and at ease, the phoenix is rising above the emotions of the physical transmission dimensions. Plasma science needs to be delivered daily via the Peace Dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. That's the end of the lesson. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Alex, for delivering. Hopefully we absorbed a bit more of this vast universal knowledge. And let's see if anyone has a question or would like to raise a point or take an exception to what was said. You're talking about exploring the universe and have we ever been there? And I was thinking, Rick likes to say 5% of the universe is matter state. So if we're going to explore the universe and the beauty of the creation and the rest, I don't think we'll do it in the matter state. 95% of the universe is the energy dimension. So if we want to go from matter state to matter state because we're so physical, I think we're going to limit ourselves in exploration of the creation. And so this energy dimension becomes quite important. Both are important. And again, you can stay in the matter state as long as you'd like, but I think you'll be limiting yourself in the knowledge and the interaction of entities that are in the energy dimension, which is probably, as you say, 95% of the universe in the energy dimension. If we go from here to another planet after that, we're still in the matter state, more or less. But I think we can stay here on this planet, extend our physicality, and explore the entire universe using our energy dimension. How do you feel with that, Alex? Or because we're so physical, we have to go from matter state to another matter state? I think we're going to miss a lot of the interaction and the beauty of the creation.
No, I think your assessment is quite brilliant. You cannot manifest without an environment. And as such, when you have the sudden shock, say as a soldier, all your emotion is wrapped up in your physical assemblage, ready to attack, and then suddenly your plans change. Your emotion becomes unresolved, and at that point in time, you're not at ease. In fact, you're quite distressed, and that is the food for the ego. And that's the problem. If you want to transmute, you cannot do so in a distressed state. You have to be detached and at ease. And since you are still heavily attached to your physicality, and you're still attached to the, shall we say, the attention of the grounding forces, then you are trapped. And this is the dilemma for a lot of souls, and why it takes so long for them to graduate, if you will. And each soul is on his own path, but each soul has also a purpose, and each of us is a teacher. And so sometimes the way we teach is by example. And so it's really not appropriate for us to judge, to say, well, if a soldier perishes in the war, that soldier will have an unresolved conflict, because that soldier could have very easily a resolved issue, because the actual slaughter of his physicality may be the release that he requires, and it will be a welcome thing, because it will be a freedom, a breaking of the bondage of the eagle's bondage. And so the eagle's gift is that when you achieve that, well, then you're free. But until then, you are food. So we individually, in our soul intentions, have that control, and we need to recognize it. And that soul dimension transcends the matter states.
Right, I think you could, observe the matter state, the 5% in the energy dimension, and you can interact in the 95% as an energy. But if you're in the matter state, I think you're confined to about 5% of exploration. So we're going to have to use this energy, I think, and again, it's an individual choice, if we're going to really become passengers of the universe or interact with the citizens of the universe. Some are in the matter state, but most appear at this point of my understanding to be in the energy dimension. I don't think the creator's in the matter state, although does manifest in the form of Mitra, but the creator is in the energy dimension for the most part. And there's probably a lot of entities, again, 95% energy, 5% matter state. So I think we're going to be using the matter state, and we can do it all from here. This is the beauty of it. You don't have to physically die, and you don't have to leave the planet. You just expand your energy dimension, and you can interact right across the universe. This is what it seems like to me. Anyone else want to make a comment about that? I know we've been asking how to create this rotation and the rest of it, but apparently the soul is already rotating. And I know Mr. Kesh was saying that they're going to bring in systems to match that rotation, at least on the outer boundaries. So having to create a rotation, I think we're already in motion in so many ways. And that rotation will just become aware. It'll become an awareness for us rather than something we have to force to rotate or happen. I'm not sure about that, but that's what it seems to me. I know we talked about rotating the fields and the rest of it, but it does seem like we're already in a rotation for sure. At least the soul is, and I would imagine all the other energies are moving as well. I don't know what the why we have to match the rotation, but apparently they have systems to match that, and this will help in the, it would seem maybe in both the physical transmutation and the energy transmutation, which I think is going to be the majority of the practice in the energy dimension. Just my thinking. Anyone else want to add to that? or comment on that?
So Mark, I would like to thank everybody for allowing me to make these presentations. We're trying to make some points, and these points have to do with the fact that our physicality and our manifestation of our physicality is governed by our emotions, and we need to understand what it means. So for instance, we cannot force our way into the transmutation process, and we cannot do this by lording. It has to be done skillfully and in a welcome manner. And that has to come from within the individual, and each individual has that capability. So, we really have to ask some really, really tough questions. And when we come up with those tough answers to those questions, then we will see changes afoot. So the thing that all of us as knowledge seekers are starting to realize is that what we've been doing in a transgenerational manner has not been working. And why are these transgenerational bindings being carried forward? So the exchange of energy isn't just from our immediate presence, but it also comes from our history. And we don't need to hang on to that, because life is for learning. And so this is our little garden of learning. And one of the things on a personal note that I've noticed is that in the process of reviewing all the mistakes that I've made, it shows me all the things that I needed to learn. And as dismayed as I am about these mistakes, by detaching the emotional aspect of it and saying, my God, how stupid you were, into saying, thank you very much for teaching me. I'm very grateful, so that I don't have to do this again. And then we have to become even more skillful. And this is a challenge for all of us, because now we have new frontiers. We have new visions. We have new hopes. And we have a new understanding of what life is all about. And can we fully understand it? I don't think we have the skill set developed. We have the skill set inherent in our genes, but we haven't developed it. So we need to practice, to repeat and review. And this allows us to become better, more qualified. But do we do this with the specific purpose of getting better, or does it just become a process? And it's very easy in that regard just to think good, do good, and be good, because only good comes from that. And this is everything what the Creator creates. Everything the Creator created is good. So if we understand that and come together with that, then we can become at one and at peace with that of the Creator. And we have nothing to fear. We just need to be detached and at ease, and then we can soar and be free. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for coordinating us here.
No problem. Anyone else want to bring anything else? Yes, I think as he told Eleonora there, what's the biggest problem of man going into space? And that will be ignorance, as he said. I think he's again referring to us traveling the spans of the universe. So perhaps we'll play half ball court for now and just move around this planet and learn the ins and outs of the matter and then test our skills going out into the universe. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe some are ready to do that, but it does seem like it's quite a large place. I think we'll still be tethered in so many ways till we start to get it correct, but we'll be practicing on this planet, the transmutation and the moving of the energies and the rest of it till we become much more comfortable with it, and then we'll probably take it further. But I want to thank everyone for joining, and as Alex said about these three wise men, they provide huge shielding, and it's a good practicing of your reactors to think good, speak good, and act good. They create plasmas. We're creating plasmas all the time, and if you stay in this, I think you create a beautiful shielding and a balance, if you can, within your structure in so many ways. So may you be proud of the work you do, may you be proud of the person you are, and may you be proud of the difference you make. It does seem like we have quite a ways to go, but I think as these systems get rolled out and certain other things come into play, we're going to see quite a pouring out of all this knowledge and technology simultaneously around the planet. And we're all, in a way, cheering it on, following Mr. Kesh and trying to understand the teachings and being part of this. I think the most important work that we can do, again, is the elevation of the world leaders, political leaders, and elevating ourselves as well. This is what's going to allow that dam to break in so many ways. So yes, Mr. Kesh is working on the borders in the background, showing the transmutation, but still, as he said, they're still going to try and control us. But he says, I don't see how they can once the transmutation has been mastered. And again, if you're being sought after, one day you can be a Chinese man, another day you can be an African, and the next day you'll be an American. It'll be almost like catch me if you can. And this is where we're heading into the opening up past the matter state. As he said, we're opening the mystery of the matter state of entity to its energies. And again, it's for you to find it within yourself and apply it and trigger it. And of course, he has systems to help us do this as well. So we're in a win-win situation, better than we've ever been on this planet. And we will see the change. It's already here, as Mr. Kesh said, but just a few more things have to be added, or a few more touches. And we're going to play anew tomorrow when we conclude in the and then the final disclaimer. But this is the idea of all entities, all created beings in the universe will have the capability to transmute between the dimension of energy and the dimension of matter state as you choose.
Thanks very much, Mark. Take the screen. I have to go into the background.
Here we go. I should have taken that screen already. Okay, let me just see here with this new. I'm just looking share. Okay, let's try this. We'll continue that and we'll go here. And again, this is what I was reading from here. Sorry, I hadn't taken the screen. That's happened a couple of times, but just wanted to show you that. And thank you all for carrying a small corner of this very, very large carpet. And